Good morning, everybody. Yes, yes. I'd like to.
Well, I saw your name on the program, and I was coming anyway.
I'd like to welcome everybody to DePaul. I'd like especially to welcome everybody to this particular conference put on by the Center for Animal Law under the direction of Professor Maggie Livingston. Maggie is, of course, one of the most eclectic intellects we have at the school, ranging from doing work on everything from animal welfare and animal rights to commercial law, which I think exemplifies one of the great traditions both of intellectual eclecticism and of concern for the most helpless, in this case, quite clearly the most helpless among us. Today there will be a number of nationally recognized speakers. I'm delighted to say that includes one of my former colleagues at a prior institution, Gary Francione, who by virtue of jet travel and everything else working in the modern world will be able to join us later today. I'm delighted to be able to support this center and its endeavors here at the school, and this symposium examining the legal protection of animals used in entertainment touches on one of the most important questions associated with our use of other beings on the planet. Of course, we all know that we have very little choice. We are consumers, sometimes including our fellow creatures, but the use in other realms, the use merely for entertainment, asks a whole series of other questions about how we relate to the natural environment and the creatures that we can control, and the questions that are associated with how and whether we are in fact exploiting them when we use them for mere entertainment. I'm delighted that we're here today to talk about these very, very important questions of our relationship with the rest of the world, and under the direction of Maggie, who will speak next. I'm certain that today's conference will be every bit the success that the rest of her work and the rest of the work at the center has been over the past few years. Maggie, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean Mark. I'd like to add my words of welcome to those of the Dean. We're very grateful to have all of you here today, and we hope that you find the day's panels interesting and informative. Animals have been used for entertainment purposes for centuries. In 16th century France, for example, it was common to celebrate Midsummer Day by burning one or two cats at a public bonfire attended by the royal family. In 18th century England, wealthy amateur physiologists tortured animals for the amusement of their guests, carving up, dismembering, and gutting living animals in so-called home petty experiments. Of course, we've come a long way since those times, but animals are still used in many entertainment venues, and in some cases sacrifice their lives in the name of sport or amusement. Today we will explore the law's role in protecting animal participants in entertainment activities, while at the same time allowing those activities to continue on some level. Before I introduce our first panel, which deals with horse and dog racing, I would like to thank some individuals who were instrumental in supporting, planning, and setting up today's event. Dr. Florence Wissig Dunbar, who was a graduate of the law school in 1945, remembered the Center for Animal Law with a testamentary bequest that enabled the center to begin its important work of exploring the proper role of the law in protecting animals. In addition, certain individuals made gifts specifically to support today's event. Pat Spaggett of Oak Park, Illinois, Dennis Shear of North Aurora, Illinois, who is also DePaul JD, and Professor Glenn Weissenberger, the former Dean of the College of Law. In addition, of course, Dean Mark generously provided funding from the Dean's Fund for today's event. Graduate Research Fellow and DePaul Law grad Brett Harrison Davinger spent many hours securing our impressive speakers, arranging for their transportation and housing, publicizing the symposium, and generally overseeing all the details of bringing the symposium to fruition. Marketing consultant Kathy Stanton, working with marketing director Courtney Moore and webmaster Dennis Stone, applied her creative talents in developing our polished and effective website and publicity materials, and I would like to recognize Brett and Kathy individually, if you would stand for a moment. Truly, today's event could not have come into being without their help. Also, our wonderful DePaul Law students energetically got the word out about the event, and I want to particularly thank the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund and the Entertainment Law Society for their efforts. One final note before we begin the presentations. We made every effort to secure panelists holding a range of views on these controversial topics, but it proved very difficult to secure the participation of industry representatives, though we do have some today. In one case, an industry representative withdrew from a panel a few weeks ago out of concern that his industry would not be fairly portrayed. The goal of today's symposium is not to label some people as good and others as bad, but to shed light on difficult legal and social questions associated with the use of animals in entertainment. There is no question that public sentiment supports the continued existence on some level of horse racing, zoos, circuses, and TV and film use of animals. The essential point is to what extent can the law consider animal welfare in the regulation of these activities. I'd like to now introduce the first panel, which will cover regulation of horse and dog racing. Besides myself, we have former jockey Kim Valine. Kim grew up in Southern California and Tennessee. She's the daughter of a polo player, and she also pursued an undergraduate degree in animal science and agriculture. In 1987, she began her 16-year-long career as a jockey, and she has also been a pharmaceutical representative specializing in equine pharmaceuticals. Today, she lives in New Orleans with her dog Dane, where she renovates houses. Next, we have Tracy McGonigal, who is Executive Director of the Hooved Animal Humane Society since March of 2011. She's been an attorney for 19 years, specializing in animal law for 10 years. She was an assistant defender with the Office of the State Appellate Defender and was associated with McKenna Storer LLC. Finally, Christine Dorschak has professional experience in animal protection. She is president and general counsel for Grade 2K USA. Before obtaining her law degree, she worked as research director for the New England Anti-Vivisection Society and was the manager of the Ellen Gifford Sheltering Home for Cats in Boston. She's a long-distance runner, having competed in 6 marathons. And she enjoys spending free time with her 4 cats and greyhound Zoe. So I want to welcome all our panelists for this first presentation. Martin?
You're all set.
I think I'm all set. Okay, great. Wonderful. So I'm going to talk about regulation of horse racing under state law and trade association rules. Kim will give us an insider's perspective on her life as a jockey. Tracy will talk about regulation of horse racing at the federal level, and then finally Christine will talk about the distinct topic of greyhound racing. Horse racing industry in the U.S., it's still a multi-billion-dollar industry employing thousands of people. It's certainly not at its zenith anymore. It's somewhat fallen off from its peak years, but it is still something that is enjoyed by millions of fans. Many celebrities own a share, either in whole or in part, of horse racing, horses who race, and fans enjoy betting on and watching races. Recently, there has been a lot of public dissatisfaction with fatalities at racetracks. So, for example, Barbaro won the Kentucky Derby in 2006, and then in the Preakness Stakes, he broke his hind leg. And his owners committed about 8 months to try to rehabilitate him, and finally he could not be rehabilitated from the leg break, and he was euthanized in early 2007. And one of his owners said, "Grief is the price you pay for love." So we get a sense that some owners are deeply attached to their horses, have a great deal of affection for them. At the same time, you might ask, well, was all that effort made for Barbaro because of love or because of a desire to preserve him for possible stud fees that could run into the millions in the future? You know, one can be skeptical or one can be more hopeful about the attitudes. We just don't know. Subsequent to that, 8 Bells in 2008 was a filly running against a group of male horses in the Kentucky Derby. She finished second to Big Brown, and almost as soon as she crossed the finish line, she broke both of her front ankles and had to be euthanized by injection on the track before millions of horrified fans. In the 2011-2012 racing season at Aqueduct in New York, there was a 100% increase in horse fatalities over the prior season. Much of this was linked to the increased purses when a gambling casino was opened next to Aqueduct, and the winnings from the gambling casino were fueling the size of the purses, incentivizing owners and trainers perhaps to push horses through a drug regimen to perform better, run faster. Starting in the spring of this year, the New York Times ran a series of articles, you may have seen them, on horse racing in America, and came out with the startling statistic that 24 horses die each week at American tracks. That is a greater rate than in countries where drug use is severely restricted. There were numerous instances cited in these articles of corticosteroids being injected into horses in the days leading to fatal races. There's a number of drugs used in racing, and Kim, you're probably familiar with most of these. Phenylbutazone, which is known as Bute, is an anti-inflammatory used to control pain. Estrone is an estrogen-based hormone used to prevent pulmonary hemorrhaging while the horse is running. Lasix is it's a brand name actually for a diuretic that reduces blood pressure to prevent pulmonary bleeding. And flunexin is a potent anti-inflammatory that is faster acting than Bute. And this is just a sampling of the many different drugs that are used on racehorses. In some cases, they have a therapeutic value to try to help the horse heal. In some cases, they're used to mask pain and lameness so that horses will be allowed to run even though perhaps they're not entirely fit. Who are the stakeholders with respect to horse racing? We obviously have the owners of the animals. They want to make money during the horses' racing days, and then for really excellent performers, they want to preserve that horse for breeding later on. The trainers want to assure better performances of horses in their care, so trainers have to win. If they don't win, they don't get jobs training horses. Jockeys, and Kim of course can speak to this very directly, they are often protective of their mounts. Some of them are true horsemen and horsewomen. They want to win, obviously, but they want to avoid injury both for the horse and for themselves, because the horse is going down, the jockey's usually going down with the horse. The vets are kind of caught in the middle, because obviously veterinarians take an oath which requires them to treat the animals in their care appropriately, but at the same time, vets employed by tracks are under pressure to, again, get horses ready so that they can race. Fans want to see exciting races, and a lot of fans enjoy the thrill of wagering and so on, but I think more recently the public has had a general revulsion against the level of fatalities that we see. There's been sort of a desire to see that go away. And then you have people who are animal welfare advocates who are concerned about how horses are treated during their lifetime at the track, and then after that, what happens to a horse that is no longer winning, that has to be retired? What is the aftercare for those horses? Now my talk today is going to focus on the drug use that is employed for horses, but There's a separate question, of course, of what you do with a horse after it's finished its racing career. In terms of state regulation, horse racing is legal in 43 states. Parimutuel betting is allowed in 38 of those states. States can license participants, adopt and enforce rules and regulations regarding equine care and medication, assure the safety of jockeys and horses. However, enforcement at the state level is often viewed as lax, and infractions are sometimes ignored, and the penalties are viewed as light in many cases. We're going to take a look at 3 major horse racing states. Kentucky, of course, because we think of Kentucky as being perhaps the classic horse racing state. Illinois, because we're here and we have a horse racing industry. And then New York, which is sometimes called the capital of American horse racing. The Kentucky Horse Racing Commission regulates racing in the state of Kentucky, and Kentucky administrative regulations allow medication to be administered only under a veterinarian's direction. Generally, narcotics, tranquilizers, stimulants, masking agents are not allowed in racing animals. Some of this, of course, is for the protection of the animals, but some of it is to level the playing field. So you don't want some horses in the wagering environment. You don't want some horses to have an unfair advantage because they have a stimulant in their system, or they have a tranquilizer that's helping them mask their pain. So you want everybody, it's like steroids in professional sports. You don't want some people or some participants to have an unfair advantage because they've been enhanced through medication. In 2010 in Kentucky, emergency regulations were pushed through to require out-of-competition testing. So there's been race day testing for a long time. But the question is, well, if you have a horse clean on race day, is it possible that that horse was medicated up until a few days before race day? Out-of-competition testing aims at detecting blood doping agents that can't be detected in routine post-race tests that occur right after a race is concluded. The regulation was fast-tracked because Churchill Downs had signed a contract to host the Breeders' Cup in November 2010, and Kentucky wanted to present itself as kind of a leader in this area. The Kentucky Horse Racing Commission recommended as penalties a 5 to 10-year license suspension for owners and trainers, and a fine of up to $50,000 and forfeiture of purse money. Kentucky has been deeply divided over reforms directed at limiting drugs. In late August of this year, the Thoroughbred Owners and Breeders Association and the Jockey Club supported new drug regulations approved by the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission after a year-long process. But on the other hand, the Kentucky legislature, a subcommittee in the legislature, the Kentucky Horsemen's Benevolent and Protective Association, and racetrack vets opposed those regulations. The regulations allow only government vets, actually state-employed vets, to administer race day drugs to horses, and the regs also reduce the allowable level of abuse. Kentucky Governor Steve Beshear sided with the reformers and implemented the new regulations using his executive authority on August 30th of 2012. The Kentucky legislature could still overturn the emergency regulations down the road. A proposed regulation to be considered by the legislature would phase in a race day ban of furosemide, which is an anti-bleeding drug, in graded or listed stakes races in Kentucky. So there's still reform that's in the pipeline that may come to fruition. In Illinois, the Illinois Racing Board regulates horse racing, and Illinois law specifically prohibits the administration of hypnotics, narcotics, stimulants, depressants, or any chemical substance that affects a horse's speed within 24 hours of a race. And administration of such a substance can result in prosecution as a Class 4 felony and suspension or revocation of the license of the owner or trainer. In Illinois, like many states now, forbids the use of anabolic steroids in racehorses as opposed to corticosteroids, which are still allowed. And anabolic steroids are the ones that, really beef people and animals up, and that have been used in, obviously, in professional sports. Illinois has approved out-of-competition testing. Horses to be tested may be selected at random with probable cause, or as determined by the board for out-of-competition testing. Both blood doping and gene doping agents are prohibited. New York. Okay, the State Racing and Wagering Board in New York oversees horse racing, including parimutuel betting, both on and off track. And the New York Racing Association, up till recently, has owned the major tracks and can establish stricter rules than those handed down by the state board. So, for example, the state board fined trainer Jeff Mones $2,500 and suspended him for 7 days for medicating his horse just hours before a race and then repeatedly lying about it. The New York Racing Association, however, barred him for 6 months, which is effective only within the state of New York, so obviously he can pursue his profession in other states. On race days, the official vet of the Racing Association must examine all horses to determine whether they are fit to run and or have drugs in their systems. And there's been a recent push to extend drug testing beyond race days. New York recently passed out of competition laws that allow the board to test horses without advance notice for blood doping, gene doping, and protein and peptide-based drugs. Horse testing positive for those substances may be declared ineligible to run. There's a minimum penalty of a 10-year suspension. Reform efforts are afoot, or ahoof, I guess we would say, in New York. In May 2012, Governor Cuomo announced creation of a new board to replace the New York Racing Association with the goal of reforming the industry. So the New York Racing Association was really put under the control of the state government because it was deemed to be kind of a scandal-ridden organization. The Racing Association acquiesced in being placed under control of the government appointees for 3 years. The new board's mandate, the new government-appointed board, is to examine the role of drugs in horse racing. Extraordinary security measures were in evidence at the Belmont Stakes in June of 2012. There was strict isolation of horses, monitoring of food, and there was close scrutiny of trainers and owners to ferret out improper use of medication. Very recently, September 28th, there was a task force report in the National Thoroughbred Racing Association Safety and Integrity Alliance, which had studied the breakdowns at Aqueduct during the 2011-2012 season. The Alliance has decided to do spot checks to ensure that accredited racetracks like Aqueduct follow its code of standards. Examining vets told the task force that findings of lameness, fever, etc. were not to be included in a horse's regulatory record. So the vets on site were told to minimize any kind of ailment in the horse and not to put that into the horse's official record. Last Thursday, October 11th, the New York State Racing and Wagering Board enacted new rules restricting drug use and requiring trainers to disclose treatments, no corticosteroids within 5 days of a race, no injection of corticosteroids into the joints of a horse within 7 days, no Depo-Medrol, which is a very powerful corticosteroid, within 15 days of a race, and no clenbuterol within 21 days of race day. Regulatory vets will be given more independence from racetrack officials, and the state will hire an equine medical director to ensure safety at the tracks. So I'm going to talk briefly about the National Thoroughbred Racing Authority. This is a trade association, and it formed a Safety and Integrity Alliance in 2009. The alliance uses a self-regulatory model to implement reforms on a national basis. It seeks to partner with state and local governments to ensure implementation of optimal and uniform regulations. Code of Compliance covers 6 areas: injury reporting and prevention, creation of safer racing environments, aftercare, mitigation and testing, jockey safety and health, and then wagering security. Since the formation in 2009, the Alliance has accredited 24 tracks, certifying their compliance with the Alliance's Code of Standards. There's an extensive application process, on-site inspection, interviews of key racetrack personnel, observation of racetrack operations, and a complete access to the racetrack premises. Accreditation lasts for 2 years maximum, and if you don't comply with the standards, you can suffer suspension or revocation of your accreditation. Tracks seem eager to get this accreditation as kind of a seal of approval, and seemingly it's argued that it has improved the quality of participating tracks, not paying. The state regulatory involvement incentivizes compliance with the Alliance Code, so the Alliance seeks to partner with governments to work together to ensure safety at the track. And the ultimate result, we hope, is institutional change on a national level. So going forward, the push for reform of drug use and racing conditions is likely to continue. Some states will be more at the forefront than others. Some level of non-uniformity and lax enforcement may persist. And that will lead to a speech we'll have in a little bit about national or federal legislation. Does Congress need to intervene to protect equine competitors? Thank you, and I will hand things off to Kim at this point. So we do this slideshow, right?
Maggie about covered everything, so it's like, anyways, I was on a racetrack for 20 years. Learned a little bit about racehorses, and everything she said is pretty right on, except for, I think that, well, I'll get to it later, the New York Times article that's going on with Barbara and all that stuff is a little bit different. But basically, I was on the track for 17 years, equine pharmaceuticals, know a lot about drugs, know a lot about accidents on the track. On most racetracks in the United States, we are pretty well watched over. You can't get away with too much on the track, but what people don't realize that is a racetrack is a business. And from the time a horse is born, it takes almost 3 years before it becomes a racehorse and gets on the racetrack. And that's a lot of money invested in a horse. So people tend to take pretty good care of their horses on the racetrack. And as you can tell, I've never done this before. Anyways, they start their careers on the track as a 2-year-old. So your first horses get on the track when they're 2 years old. And some are athletes and some aren't. And probably 6 out of every 10 horses never really make it as a racehorse. They don't want to run. You can't make them run no matter what kind of drugs you give a horse. So where I think people think that you can enhance a horse's performance by giving them drugs, a lot of horses just don't want to be racehorses. You can't make them drink. You can't make them do anything. They're not going to run any faster than they want to. Just like a lot of people are athletes, or a lot of people aren't athletes. They're just not going to make it in the racetrack world. So racehorses are a business. My dad's a breeder, and he probably breeds, he has a breeding farm. He probably breeds about 100 mares a year between 2 stallions. By the time you end up with a 2-year-old, you can have easily $100,000 into a horse. And it costs about $100 a day to train a horse to become a racehorse. So at $100 a day on a racetrack, if you have a horse that's not going to run, it costs the same to feed a cheap horse as it does an expensive horse. So you want the best horses you can get. Horses are bred to run. They're made to run. When you're on a racehorse, you know he wants to be there. It's not, you're not making him go any faster. You just know when you're on a great horse that he's competitive, like a great runner. You just know they're going to pass, they're going to be there. Now, drug testing. We're both tested a lot. Jockeys are tested every day. They pull a pill out of a box, and 5 jockeys a day are tested for drugs. And horses that, every horse that finishes first or second in a race is sent to a test bar, and they test them for everything. So, and if they don't do a urine test, they'll pull blood on them. And so every single horse that's out there gets tested. As far as trainers go, it's kind of interesting. Maggie had said it was kind of lax with them. The third time a trainer gets in trouble for something, he's off the track. He's ruled off for life. The first time he is fine. The second time he's fine. Bute, the drug that she was talking about, is almost, it's like taking an Advil. So whereas everybody says Bute, it's an anti-inflammatory, it'd be like if you took 4 Advil and accidentally on race time, there's still a little bit left in your system. So Bute isn't a big nasty drug. Lasix, the other drug, is used as a diuretic, and it shrinks your mucus. Horses tend to blow a membrane, and sometimes they'll bleed. In Europe, they won't use Lasix. Here we do. Here, honestly, jockeys do too. We use it to lose weight real quick before a race when we weigh in. Not a real dangerous drug. No, it's just a diuretic. So that was the 2 main drugs. The other drug she was talking about, which is a corticosteroid, equipoise, and Winstrol. Jockeys don't do that unless they take hormone pills. Some jockeys do, but anyways, they give them that just to pump them up a little bit. Probably not the best thing to do. You know, it'd be like having 3 cups of coffee before a race. But horses also, back in the olden days, they used to give them coffee grinds to make them sweat and make them go and get a little caffeine in them. But nowadays, none of that. Like I said, it's really controlled a lot more. The big bad words, Bute and Lasix, are nothing that I wouldn't take on a race day if I was really sore or had to lose weight. Humane or inhumane. This is Barbara, the horse she was talking about, and Maggie had brought this up before. To me, this was the most, and to everybody I know on a racetrack, this was the most inhumane thing you could have ever done to a horse in a million years. A horse cannot live on 3 legs, and people don't realize that. They're 1,200 pounds, they can't live on 3 legs, they have to balance. It goes with their digestive system, and they colic if they can't stand on them. And also, if they'll end up with pneumonia, they just can't do it. And they don't, people now are saying, well, we can put a prosthetic leg on a horse. Well, what quality of life he's going to have? He's going to be sitting in a stall with a prosthetic leg. Now, injuries that are compound on a horse, a leg injury, not good. And the Barbaro should have been destroyed immediately. We were all watching it and horrified when they decided to do this. Look at this poor horse, he's terrified, he's got a blindfold on, he's got earplugs in his ears. He had to be held up like that for 8 months. This horse, I mean, he just suffered. It was not a good quality of life for a horse. So, to me, that was horrendous. Now, there's other injuries on racehorses that can be fixed. This is like, this is Kentucky in the Equine Center for Sports Medicine. Horses will get chips in their knees, and you might take a chip out of a knee and then they rehab them, or you might get, just like any athlete, if you have shin splints, you're set out, or they get some vascular thing in their hooves. They will do everything to save a horse, but to try to save a horse with a compound fracture is I mean, it's just cruel, it's inhuman, and chances are that they're just gonna die. In my opinion, it is, from being on a train. This was an interesting article, and this is what Maggie was referring to on the New York Times, mangled horses and maimed jockeys. And 9 months ago, my dad sent me this article, and I printed it and put it in my top drawer because I didn't want to read it, because it was a friend of mine that was on this horse that got hurt, actually an acquaintance, who had stayed at my house a couple times for the Mardi Gras futurity at the fairgrounds. I think in this article they said, well, I know 24 horses a week die on U.S. tracks. So what they didn't say is that's 24 altogether a week on U.S. tracks from all the horses around, and that wasn't just injuries. I mean, that's sickness, everything. So according to that New York Times ad, I had figured out that there's 114,000 horses that run on all U.S. tracks. It just wasn't thoroughbred, so I called up the buggy horses and the trotters and everything. So it ended up being a little over 1% of horses die on U.S. tracks. I know it's not a good thing, but that's not like a big high number to me when you're talking about athletes and people that have heart attacks and things like that. Horses do have heart attacks, like people have heart attacks. There's strokes, there's heart attacks, there's things like that. There's illness, there's colic. It's sad to see a horse break a leg. As a rider, I hate it. And the higher they break a leg, the more bones we break. I've broken 31 bones in races. So we protect ourselves, and we hope that, you know, the track protects us, and the vets protect us, and the trainers protect us. But in my whole life, it comes up to be like a big bad world. But if you look it up, there's only 2 or 3 trainers a year that get ruled off for life. So those are the bad guys. It'd be like 2 or 3 lawyers being disbarred a year. I'm sure there's more lawyers that get disbarred than trainers on racetracks. So it's coming off as a bad deal, and I can understand it because it's really sad when you're watching the top of the top on a racetrack break a leg. It's horrible. None of us want to see it. None of us want to see our friends go down. It's sad. There's probably, this article really freaked me out a little bit because the night my friend or my acquaintance had stayed at the house, there were 7 other riders at my house. And I'm the only one that's not paralyzed or brain damaged right now out of that group of jocks at my house that night. So it was a while ago, but anyway, so the thing is, we have the option too, when we're on a horse, to take the horse to the starting gate and tell the vet we didn't feel comfortable on him, count him scratch. So we have the final say before we get to the starting gate. So if we're in the post parade and we feel our horse is off, we can go right to the track vet and just say, look, I don't feel comfortable on this horse, take us off. If the vet looks at the horse and thinks the horse is okay, we have the option to say, please put another jockey on. I don't feel comfortable.
Have you ever done that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you usually get fired from the barn, but you know, the guy's pissed off. But yeah, I've done it many times, and a lot of riders do. I mean, a lot of riders will get thrown in the post parade, and they'll say, "I don't want to ride this horse," and you go back. I've actually been known to go talk to a vet before the race and tell them to look at the horse I was on. I didn't feel comfortable on him, and I was the only girl rider and didn't want to lose the barn, so I wanted somebody else to make the call. But a sore horse also, this is kind of interesting, a sore horse will rarely hurt himself because a sore horse is like any sore athlete. When you're running and you start hurting, you're going to pull yourself up. Usually, you know, unless you're kind of touched or something. But most horses that get hurt really badly, and like Bells, she took that wrong step, took another wrong step, but chances are she wasn't feeling a lot of pain when she did that, or she would have pulled herself up and not put herself out or exerted herself like that. Very few horses break their back leg on the racetrack. That was rare. So, I mean, really, really rare. Now, retired thoroughbreds, they become family pets, pony horses, repurposed, become hunter jumpers, brood mares. We have a lot of horses, or my family does, that are bred really well, and they'll go out to pasture for brood mares. But it is so expensive to feed a horse right now that a lot of people aren't even, you can't even give away a horse a lot of times. I mean, we have horses I donate horses all the time if anybody wants a horse, so it's like constantly. But we donate horses to autistic children funds, things like that. You know, they go, kids like, you know, thoroughbreds, family pets, pony horses. A lot of horses stay on the track still, and that's kind of, this horse, actually I looked up, was in the paper the other day. He's a 20-year veteran of the NOPD, but he started running, he couldn't run, he didn't want to be a racehorse, and he ended up being a police horse. And now, 20 years later, he's being turned out to pasture. He's old, so this is a success story. And we donate a lot of horses also to the police department. And people come to the track a lot to buy horses for polo ponies or things like that.
What's the average lifespan of a horse?
A horse will live 27, you can get, but on a track, you'll never see a horse over 10 years old. I mean, I think the oldest horse I've ever rode in a race was 10. Yeah. And he was pretty cool. And actually, he's still on the track as just a pony horse. And the other thing is horses have flight and fright, by the way, which is another reason they can't keep casts on and stuff. They don't realize you're trying to help them. They'll knock a cast off. But horses that are injured or nervous, a lot of times we have goats on racetracks, and the goats all live in the stalls with the horses, so it's kind of, they have their own pets to keep them calm on the racetrack. It's kind of cute. That's my question as well.
I think we're going to save questions till
Okay.
till the end, but thank you, Karen. Okay, that's for that reason. While we're doing this, do you have any questions for Kim about her life at the track? Yes.
When you said that sometimes veterinary horses use words as pony horses,
Oh, pony horses are the horses you see that are next to the race horses taking them to the starting gate.
oh, okay. I thought maybe that was what you mean, like those petting zoos where you see them go in circles.
No, they wouldn't make it petting zoo horses. But no, they hold on to us when we're going to the starting gates because a lot of times the horses are a little flighty and they've calmed down by then and know they're not running.
Kim, the trainer of Big Brown was under some scrutiny for the use of steroids, I think.
Yeah.
And Big Brown won the Derby and the Preakness, right? And then he pulled up to the Belmont Stakes.
Yeah.
So there was some suggestion that between the Preakness and the Belmont, maybe the trainer had done the steroids. So do you know that?
Then, I don't know much about that case, but back then you were allowed to give equipoise and Winstrop, but so far out. And sometimes there's that line of when you take your medicine,
Yeah.
how much is in your system. And that's why I think most of your bubble comes that line of knowing.
So when a horse like Big Brown, I mean, he ended up, I think, finishing last in the Belmont, and the jockey, I think, pulled him up.
Yeah, he was sore.
He was
And
sore.
said he was sore, so they stopped. So a jockey will pull up a horse that's sore. We don't want to see him break something.
Right.
So, yeah, which was a shame, because he was a great horse. But,
And he was in the contention for the Triple Crown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, that's every jockey's dream. But if your horse is sore, you stop. You don't want to die.
And you can tell that just in the way they're aiming and.
It's like being in a car with a flat tire. All of a sudden you're in a car and you start going, no,
Unless you
stop.
guys keep letting out of gas or
Yeah,
sort of
yeah, you
slipping
never
along.
pull up.
Yeah. Yeah.
In your opinion, are most owners, trainers wanting to cooperate with the changes in rules and trying to figure out ways to circumvent the rules?
Well, I think in life there's always someone that wants to circumvent a rule, but I think most owners and trainers are pretty compliant. I mean, we don't want to see anybody getting hurt. They really don't want to see, like I said, a horse is an asset. So it'd be like, we don't want to see your house burning down. So I think within reason, I think the butte thing is kind of like taking that butte, which is like Advil and things like that. I think people overreact to that, which is just an anti-inflammatory that probably you and I could take every morning. But as far as, I don't think anybody really has a problem with the drug testing. And if they really get caught, they don't make any money. So I think everybody's pretty compliant with it. You know, quarter horse trainers are a little different, but I'm partial to thoroughbred trainers.
Can I ask one question? You used the word asset, so that would imply that racehorses are basically not necessarily considered animals, they're considered assets.
Well, I think when you're paying that much money for something, it's an animal and it is an asset. I mean, it's something that's taken care of, you protect it, and it's a way of making money. So I think on the racetrack it would be considered an asset, albeit, you know, a living asset, but it's an asset, you know. People put a lot of money into it. There's actually, at $100 a day training, there's actually one groom on average for every 3 horses, and they're watched 24/7. They're taken out of their stalls, they're taken care of, they're washed, bathed, exercise. They're an asset. It's something of value. So.
Hello everyone, my name is Tracy McGonigal and I am the Executive Director of the Hoofed Animal Humane Society. I'm going to talk to you today about some national legislation with respect to horse racing and some congressional hearings, a few other things. I don't know how many of you are familiar with my organization. No, not looking. I think you may just have to click it. Oh, okay, I'll use this. Okay, that works. Okay, perfect. All right, sorry about that. You are familiar with the Hoofed Animal Humane Society, but it's HAHS, H-A-H-S for short. It's a charitable organization. We are a 501c3 corporation, not for profit, and we're dedicated to the rescue and protection of abused and neglected hoofed animals. And just very quickly, our mission statement is to promote the humane treatment of hoofed animals through education, legislation, investigation, and if necessary, intervention, and that means impoundment. And these are some of the horses that I have at my facility. HAHS was started in 1971, so we're in our 41st year. Currently, I have 58 horses on the property, I believe. We also, most of our resources go to taking care of horses, but I do have other hoofed animals. I have a few potbelly pigs and a couple goats, a little goat that was adopted. Okay, what is the historical purpose of racing-related legislation? As you can see, I've got the dollar signs first up there and a lot of them. because it's about commerce, it's about making money for states and private interests. And an example of this is if you look at Illinois statute, the Illinois Horse Racing Act of 75, and if you look at the legislative intent, you'll see that this act is intended to benefit the people of the state of Illinois by assisting economic development and promoting Illinois tourism. The General Assembly finds and declares it to be the public policy of the state of Illinois to support and enhance Illinois' horse racing industry, which is a significant component in the agribusiness industry, ensure that Illinois' horse racing industry remains competitive with neighboring states, stimulate growth within Illinois' horse racing industry, thereby encouraging new investment and development to produce additional tax revenues and to create additional jobs. It's also to promote the further growth of tourism, encourage the breeding of thoroughbred and standardbred horses in the state. And as Kim told you, thoroughbreds are the racers, the standardbreds are the trotters, the pacers with the buggies. And ensure that public confidence and trust in the credibility and integrity of racing operations and the regulatory process is maintained. Now, as you see, what is the focus of that piece of legislation? As I look at that, they describe their legislative intent. It basically is about commerce. It's about money. It's about entertaining people. I didn't see in there anything mentioning the welfare of the animal. And I also want to say that I am not completely opposed to horse racing or anything like that at all. There are certain things within that sport that I'm opposed to, certainly. But I do want to say that the focus, as you see in that piece of legislation, is on money. It's on commerce, entertaining people, as I said. And that's typical gaming legislation. Now, the U.S. Congress has historically dealt with the issue of drugging racehorses. In 1973, there was a congressional report citing problems in racing, including drugging and poor enforcement. And we went to the early 80s. There were hearings on the Corrupt Horse Racing Practices Act that would have prohibited drugging. In 2008, following the collapse of 8 Bells, which we've heard about already, after crossing the finish line at the Kentucky Derby, there was the subcommittee hearing entitled Breeding, Drugs, and Breakdowns, the State of Thoroughbred Horse Racing and the Welfare of the Thoroughbred Horse. Now, there are some current and recurring issues. According to the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, the U.S. is the only country that still allows routine and extensive use of drugs in horse racing. Now, horse meat is still consumed by humans in Europe, I believe Japan as well. And these drugs do end up in the food supply. And we've also heard mention of bute, which is, it's like taking strong ibuprofen. I have several horses at the facility right now who are on bute. My personal horses have been on bute. But that's very, very common. However, the European Union does not allow those drugs in the food supply, which poses a problem insofar as horse meat from the United States ending up over there in Europe. And I'm going to digress from my PowerPoint for 1 second. Last Friday, October 12th, the slaughterhouses in Canada and Mexico, because we don't have slaughterhouses any longer on American soil, so all the horses are shipped to Canada or Mexico. Canadian slaughterhouses for sure, and possibly the Mexican ones, refused to accept any American horses for slaughter last Friday because the European Union was concerned. This is what they think. We haven't really gotten a complete answer. The European Union was concerned about the traceability of drugs because what they want is a complete history of drug use in the animal. I mean, I have 58 horses on my property right now. I can only tell you what they've had since they've been with me, but all the years that they haven't been there, there's no way anybody could possibly let anyone know, truthfully, what drugs these horses have had, so what would be entering the food supply there. So everyone was up in arms, what's going to happen? Because now you have all of these horses that were destined for slaughter. What are you going to do with them? Because the Canadians were not accepting them. I don't believe that the Mexican houses were accepting them either. So over the weekend, everyone was in a tizzy about that. And on Monday, just 2 days ago, Canada started accepting them again. So we don't know exactly why there was this. There has not been unless it came out this morning, I have not seen an official notification as to why this happened. But I was always concerned because of the European Union is so against these drugs being in that food supply, how they could take any of our horses anyway, because you just don't know. I mean, you really don't know what they've had, what they've taken. at all. Like I said, out of all of the horses that I have, they come from your dubious beginnings. By the time they get to me, and I can tell you what I've given them, but not before that. Okay, we also, some of this is going to be repetitive because we all have the same information, that 24 horses die in U.S. tracks a week. I got that from Senator Tom Udall from New Mexico, one of his statistics. In addition to that, horses do die, not only while they're running races, but when training for races as well. They may die of race-related injuries long after a race. Many feel that drugs are the main culprit because they allow the animals to be pushed harder and encourage racing at unsafe speeds. So, in order to address this, the Interstate Horse Racing Improvement Act of 2011 was introduced in 2011 by U.S. Senator Tom Udall, Democrat, New Mexico, and U.S. Representative Ed Whitfield, who's a Republican from Kentucky. I believe that Jan Schakowsky, Illinois, was instrumental in that as well. The bill amends the Interstate Horse Racing Act of 1978, which can be found at 15 U.S. Code 3001 et sec, and it will prohibit anyone from entering a horse in a race where there is betting on the race if the horse is under the influence of a performance-enhancing drug. There's a 3 strikes and you're out penalty. The first drug violation calls for a fine of at least $5,000 and a suspension of at least 180 days. The second violation calls for a fine of not less than $20,000 and a suspension of not less than 1 year. And the third one would call for a fine of not less than $50,000 and a permanent ban from horse racing. It does not specify which party would get the penalty. Also, the horse in question would be penalized not less than 180 days for the first offense and not less than 1 year for the second offense, not less than 2 years for a third offense. The suspension or permanent ban would mean the violator could not participate in any activities, including as a spectator at a race where there is interstate off-track betting. Now, this act also invokes the powers of and reviewed by the Federal Trade Commission. A violation would also be considered an unfair or deceptive trade practice, and the Federal Trade Commission would have enforcement authority unless there was an agreement for a state or horse racing commission to handle that. The FTC could still step in and enforce these provisions if the host racing commission does not adequately do so. The FTC would monitor and handle enforcement with respect to violations occurring in multiple states and in connection with nonprofits. Now, interestingly enough, it would provide for a private right of action. And that means that organizations or individuals with standing could bring an action for injunction or other relief to enforce these provisions and even obtain damages or restitution and attorney's fees. And of course, as attorneys, we all like to hear that. That's out there. A little self-interest there. Okay, this was mentioned earlier as well. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo recently reached an agreement with state legislators that once the Horse Racing Improvement Act of 2011 becomes law, the governor and state legislature will take control of the New York Racing Association. Now, criticism of the proposition is that state regulators lack the funding, the incentive, and the expertise to conduct proper, effective investigation. The Drug Enforcement Agency and the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, have been suggested as potential investigators under this act. The current lack of policing has led some owners to buy and breed horses in Europe where horses do not race on drugs. Now, what is the status of the Interstate Horse Racing Improvement Act of 2011? In May of 2011, it was referred to committee where it has remained. And I checked the US.gov website, which predicts that it has a 2% chance of being passed right now. So I don't know what the future is of this act, but I felt you should all know about it. Okay, congressional hearings of 2012. In the spring and summer of 2012, there were several congressional hearings basically addressing drugging and health and safety. Health and safety issues in horse racing was in the subcommittee of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. And that was to review measures taken since 2008 to protect horses, jockeys, and the integrity of the sport. On April 30th of this year, shortly before the running of this year's Kentucky Derby, the House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce, Subcommittee on Health, conducted a hearing entitled,
a review of efforts to protect the health of jockeys and horses in horse racing. In July of 2012, medication and performance-enhancing drugs in horse racing in connection with the Interstate Horse Racing Improvement Act of 2011 that was heard that addressed the use of drugs, therapeutic and illegal, in U.S. horse racing before the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Witnesses called for tougher discipline of trainers. Now, what are the issues here too? I mean, we talked about drugs, we talked about food supply issues, how that affects that going into Europe, not accepting the horse meat or not. When you have an incentive to breed animals, for personal gain, for private gain, that can lead to a problem of overpopulation. I see it every day. I mean, I could fill up my pastures, which I consider them pretty full as they are, by the end of tonight, by midnight, or probably even close of business today, by the time I got home, if I took in all of the horses that people want to donate to me. There is an overpopulation of equines, specifically horses, in this country. And as I said, when you have an incentive to breed horses for profit, I think it does lead to that. At my facility, we had several thoroughbreds. What I should say too about Haas is that we don't take owner turn-ins. My horses come from investigations into abuse and neglect, and usually our investigations or investigations in conjunction with animal control offices throughout the state, the sheriff's departments, and also throughout the country. So it is rare that we actually take owner turn-ins, but I get the calls all the time. I do have more standardbreds who are the trotters. I have them at my facility. And with both the thoroughbreds and the trotters, the standardbreds, those associations do actually give me money when I can trace them. I had one come in last year, and through her tattoo, although it was a little hard to read, I had someone come out from the Standardbred Association who read it. We were able to determine that she was indeed a registered standardbred, and they did give us some money. They donated some money to us to take care of her, and that happens as well with the Thoroughbred Association. They've given me money for the thoroughbreds that I have there, who are ex-racehorses. As I said, by close of business today, I could probably fill my entire pasture up with horses. If we took in everybody, there's such a need for that. And Kim mentioned a little bit earlier, the cost of hay right now because of the drought, it's just incredible. Last year I was paying probably $2 to $3 a bale. Now I can get it for $5.25, which is fantastic. People are paying upwards of $11 a bale. I get it cheaper because thankfully people know I'm a nonprofit, and so they take some mercy. But it's difficult. So that with an already struggling economy, the horses are, I would consider them luxury items to people. They can't, you can't afford. It's hard to afford them, typically. And then with the economy like it is, and now with hay like it is, it's rough out there. So, in order to address that, PETA came up with the Thoroughbred 360 Life Cycle Fund, which I mentioned down there as PETA's 360 plan. And what that basically does is it proposes a $360 mandatory registration fee when bulls are registered that the owners would have to pay, and that would go into a fund that would sit there, and it's for the life cycle fund of the horse. There are three basic times when the owners would be fined, and that second time is a one-time stallion and broodmare $360 registration fee, and then for each transfer, each time that horse transfers ownership, there would be a $360 fee that would go into that fund. He has asked the Jockey Club to get behind this, and estimate that would give $23 million up front, if everybody had to do this, and that could be used to rehome the thoroughbreds once they are retired from the track, or if they're found to not be suitable for racing. Because as Kim said, I've seen it. Horses do have different interests and things they like to do. Some like to jump, some like to trail ride, some like to race. They do. I mean, they will be on there. But for those that are not suitable for that situation, in my opinion, there can be quite the glut in the market. I mean, there are tons of people. I've had horses since I was 9 years old, and tons of my friends and colleagues were always getting OTTBs, off the track thoroughbreds, to use. And I think you can get them
fairly inexpensively because a lot of people, it's very expensive to keep the horse. And they basically at that point when they're not usable want to get rid of them, which is why a lot of them will end up in rescues and things like that. So this would be designed to have a pool of money to take care of these animals. And where the status of that actually I do not know. These are 3 horses that are at my facility. The red one, the chestnut, is Star Tribute. It's a mother actually and 2 daughters. Star's one of the daughters. Cassiopeia is in the middle there. She's her sister. And the mother is Nebula. And Nebula qualified for the Breeders' Cup in the 90s. She's 26 or something like that. And the daughters are 19 and 18. And I just thought I'd show you a picture of some horse racing rescue horses. Oh, they're up for adoption. But one of them, I think it was Star, did not do as well as the others on the track. But they are at my thoroughbreds. And with that, I was going to conclude and ask for questions, but I think we're holding questions.
Yeah, we're
until
going to
the
hold
end.
the questions.
So,
Thank
okay.
you, Tracy.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Christine Dorchak. I'm the co-founder, president, and general counsel of Grade 2K USA. Grade 2K USA is a national nonprofit. Looks like we're becoming international one of these days, so look for that announcement. We work to pass laws to protect greyhound dogs. And I'm here today to give you a brief history of dog racing, talk about some of the problems that are inherent to dog racing, discuss our efforts to prohibit the cruelty of dog racing, and then hopefully take some questions, because I know there's not much information out there about dog racing. So I'm happy to take any more questions after my talk. So let me begin with a brief history of greyhound racing. Greyhound racing was first introduced in the early 20th century. Before that time, greyhounds were just dogs, like any other dog. They might have been used to chase jackrabbits on farms, used in coursing, but there was no money in their speed. But then an individual named Owen Patrick Smith invented and patented the mechanical lure. This was in 1919. And that, in combination with the creation of an oval track, gave birth to dog racing in the United States. And Mr. Owen Patrick Smith was from Emeryville, and that's why the history of dog racing is called the Road from Emeryville. Dog racing was kind of a casual event in many ways. The dog tracks that started to form were actually unregulated flapper tracks. Flapper tracks could exist, close, then reopen, relocate, all in the same season. And the owners of, or the operators of the flapper track would just move to a new location, often chased away by law enforcement, because this was illegal activity. In fact, the district attorney of Los Angeles would raid the dog tracks there. He'd arrest everyone in sight and arrest them for conspiracy to evade the gambling laws, to violate the gambling laws of California. Then it was future Chief Justice Earl Warren, as the Attorney General of California, who championed the closure of the flapper tracks all across the state. He was Attorney General at that point. He went on to become governor, and of course we all know him from the Supreme Court. The flapper tracks were really run by gamblers, by criminals like Al Capone. Here in Chicago, Al Capone, he ran the old Hawthorne Kennel Club right here in the city. And criminals criminal syndicates simply used dog racing to launder money and do whatever else they wanted to do to try and make a buck. And of course, the dogs were being used, but no one was quite sure of the degree of suffering, and nobody really had a handle on it. So the flapper tracks, by the 1920s and 30s, there were about 65 of them all across the United States. These flapper tracks were something that anybody could get into. But then, in 1931, the state of Florida became the first state to legalize dog racing and put a structure on the activity. In Florida, in Florida, as you may know, there are many dog tracks, and dog racing was born in Hialeah, Florida, as a matter of fact. And in exchange for authorizing dog racing, the state of Florida got a cut of every bet made. So there was a reference before to pari-mutuel gambling. Pari-mutuel refers to the fact that the pot is only as big as the gamblers make it. The pot depends on how much money is put in by those gamblers. So what the host state would do is it would take a cut of that pot as well. So that was the deal when a state authorized dog racing. The next states to follow were Oregon in 1933 and Massachusetts, my home state, in 1934. Anti-gambling activists and humane societies brought opposition to dog racing, but it was very difficult to make an argument against any new form of revenue. And of course, the humane problems really couldn't be anticipated, and certainly they couldn't be documented at that time, so those efforts failed. In Massachusetts, for instance, anti-gambling advocates actually tried to repeal the new law right away. Unfortunately, though they tried twice back in the day, they did not succeed. If they had succeeded, I probably wouldn't be standing here today. So let's move on to today, dog racing. Let me talk about how dog racing works and what problems that we identify with dog racing, and why we feel this is an activity that must end. Today there are, in 2001, there were 49 operational tracks in 15 states. That was the year we formed. Today, in 2012, there are 22 dog tracks in just 7 states. So we have made some headway. And you can see that Florida is truly the heart of dog racing. Now, the American Greyhound Track Operators Association is the trade association that represents each of these track owners. The National Greyhound Association represents the licensees, the people who work at the track. They often call themselves dog men, though they are women as well. The kennel operators and people who actually work at the facility. Host states are charged with regulating the industry, and the state may have a racing commission, a racing department, and the main mission of these agencies is to prevent race fixing, to protect the better, not protect the greyhound. Humane rules tend to be lacking in specificity and enforcement when they do exist. By way of example, I would talk about Florida again. Florida has 13 dog tracks and no humane rules to speak of. Several years ago, advocates passed legislation that allowed the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, which is over the Division of Racing, to make humane rules for the first time. Well, they're still working on it. It's very unfortunate. There are so many so many dogs whose lives could be changed if there were just some standard rules in place, for instance, regarding cage size. That would be very helpful, but there are none. These are where all the tracks are in Florida. You can see they're all over the state, and there's a lot of breeding farms all over the state as well. Since 2002 alone, there have been multiple cases of serious neglect and outright cruelty to greyhounds in Florida. Dogs have been found cocaine positive. They've been left to starve to death. They've become sick with the horse flu that had never before jumped species. And one of the most infamous cases happened when a longtime security guard of Florida dog drives, he'd been a part-time security guard for 40 years, decided he would have a little side business. And for $10 a piece, he'd take unwanted dogs from trainers, bring them across state lines, shoot them in the head, and throw them in the pit. And he did this for years and years and years, and he was finally caught. He was charged, and we were all preparing to testify at that trial, and he died before the trial could take place. And he didn't apologize for what he did. He said, well, they need to get rid of these dogs, and I was just performing a service. That was Mr. Robert Rhodes. While all this cruelty is happening in Florida, just since 1990, the amount of tax revenue that had been generated from dog racing in that state has gone down 98%. So in 1990, it was $75 million. By last year, it was less than $3 million. So one has to ask, is the state of Florida now just actually paying for dog racing to occur? Has the cost of regulation exceeded the tax benefit? We've released a full report on Florida dog racing. It covers the humane and economic issues of this industry in Florida. We also have state-specific reports on other racing states, of which there are 7 on our website. Now I'd like to turn to the inherent problems with dog racing. And these are the problems we focus on because they are the standards of lack of care. We usually say standards of care, but this is lack of care that we're seeing. And what I'm going to talk about is true at every racetrack. The 2 main issues are the confinement of greyhounds and the injuries they suffer while racing. Greyhounds live in kennel compounds. They're small warehouses. They're kept in stacked cages. The girls on top, the boys on bottom. And they stay in those cages for an average of 22 hours a day. They're released from their cages in groups by sex to relieve themselves 3 or 4 times a day, and then they're put back in the cages. Dogs don't race every day. They race every 3 to 4 days, which means they get to go out and do a 30-second race on the race day and get thrown back in the cage. We don't think this is a good way to treat a dog. According to the Massachusetts State Racing Commission, for instance, the cages there were 32 inches wide by 42 inches deep by 34 inches high. The Greyhound Council says that greyhounds stand 23 to 30 inches at the shoulder. So a large greyhound could not fit in one of these cages. Here are some other example cages from different states. This is the New Hampshire cage, with the pink wood there. These are pretty much the same size wherever you go, and bought by the same company out in Iowa, as a matter of fact. So the industry knows what it's doing. It's been doing it like this for years. The food given to greyhounds is also problematic. The greyhounds are fed a diet based on 4D meat. USDA 4D means downer meat. It's the meat of downed, dying, disabled, and dead cows and other animals. Obviously, this makes it real cheap to feed a dog, but it's not a very healthful diet, as you can imagine. The key in dog racing, because it is doing so poorly, is to put in the least amount possible to render the most profit on the other end. And this is a great example of how kennel operators can cut costs. Another inherent problem with dog racing are the terrible injuries that the greyhounds suffer. Well, this is an example of 4D meat from a facility in Arizona, Tucson Greyhound Park. What they do is it arrives frozen, and they just put it into a big tub, and you can see it says inedible on it. It arrives frozen, they put it in a big tub, they mix in some rice and pasta, and that's the dog's meal. And some have said, well, you know, there's 4D meat in pet food. Well, pet food companies treat that meat before they put it into the can. There's no treatment for this meat. Next, I'd like to talk about the injuries the dogs suffer. The most common injury is a broken leg, and a broken leg can often be a death sentence because there's a cost-benefit analysis that is in place at all times. Is it going to be more expensive to put money, or more profitable to put money into this older horse Sorry, I'm just thinking of horses because here. Is it going to make more money for me to get a new dog, or should I put the money into giving medical treatment to this broken-legged older dog? Well, I think the answer is pretty clear there. The other injuries that we see in state records include paralysis, seizures, heat stroke, and broken necks. Dogs have even been electrocuted while racing. They bite onto the mechanical oar and get electrocuted. Some example statistics I can give you: 700 greyhounds injured and 1,000 deemed too sick to race at one West Virginia track in a 2-year period. A dog injured every 3 to 4 days in Massachusetts. 1,500 injured and 49 dead over 32 months at one track in West Virginia. So the numbers add up, and every number is a dog who deserves something better. There are many problems with dog racing, but these are the standards that we focus on because they are demonstrated with the industry's own records. This is no longer a he said, she said debate. It's a they said campaign based on the industry's own testimony. Next, I'm going to turn to the solutions. I've talked about the problems and how we try to expose those problems. Great to KUSA is a problem-solving organization. We want to end dog racing. We don't think there's any way to make this better. The legislative solutions that we bring include passing stronger player protection laws. For instance, we passed the first state-funded adoption program in one state. But our ultimate goal is to end dog racing. And our campaigns really first started in our home state of Massachusetts. It actually started in 1990, well, I won't say, date myself. I was one of 5 animal rights activists who used to stand outside Wonderland Greyhound Park with my sign. And one day, somebody heard about us and said, well, do you guys really want to end dog racing? And I said, yeah, of course. Why do you think I'm here with my sign? And he said, put down your sign. Let's go on the ballot. And this was news to me. I'm actually born in New Jersey. We don't have the ballot admission process. It's only available in 24 states, 2 of which are racing states now. And I said, okay. So we went to a meeting and found out we could put a bill before voters and we could make a law. So that's what we decided to do. So this little group of animal rights activists grew into a statewide campaign of 5,000 activists working to end dog racing in Massachusetts. But there were a lot of bumps in the road, and we learned a lot along the way. We learned that a strong campaign really depends on knowing your facts, having a thorough understanding of the political process, raising a lot of money to put ads on television. Because a ballot initiative campaign, you've got to get your message out. And we kind of knew about first part, collecting signatures, which is what we did. Here's an example of our petition, and here's our executive director. He's carrying the petitions up to be filed. We knew about that part, but we didn't know any more about it. We just figured, well, if we're right, then we win. Well, it wasn't that simple, and we were to learn that the hard way. We had actually made 3 attempts in the 1990s to pass a prohibition through the legislature of Massachusetts and failed 3 times. Ironically, it would also take us 3 times on the ballot to end dog racing through the voter referendum as well. I guess 3 is our lucky number. I personally collected thousands and thousands of signatures with the help of my trusty dog to put the first question on the ballot. That was in 2000. Unfortunately, the Greyhounds were not to win that year. We were outspent 5 to 1 on television. Talked about that money a second ago. We didn't know we had to raise $1 million to put ads on TV. We didn't know about that part. And we had tried to do so, but it was too late, and we just didn't have enough money to get out our message. Additionally, 4 of us were sued for $10 million. Boy, that's a wake-up call. We were sued based on defamation of character by a track owner named Charlie Sarkis. And I'm just going to skip ahead for a second. That's Charlie right there. Charlie didn't care for the fact that we had used a video clip of him speaking to one of the news folks about dog racing. We put it right in our ads on television. So he sued for defamation of character, and he asked the court to remove our ads from the air. And this was 5 days before the election. Wow. We actually overcame the injunction. We were not censored, thankfully. And ultimately, sometime after the voter question took place, Charlie was forced to pay our attorney's fees because the court said it was a slap suit intended to interfere with our political campaign, which was pretty obvious. We were glad to win, finally, but didn't help any dogs. So, not to be put down, we said, let's try it again. Then we found out we had to wait 6 years to do it. So, okay, we're going to start making our case. So we passed a law requiring the state of Massachusetts to provide injury reports of greyhounds racing in the state. And we accumulated all those records. And this was really the basis of our case. So in 2005, the Dog Protection Act was filed. And the Dog Protection Act not only prohibited dog racing, it increased penalties for harming service dogs, and also strengthened laws against dog fighting. Let's see if I can go back on this. Go back to this. Do you know how to go back on this, Margaret?
It's the left.
Ah, thank you. So we brought the Dog Protection Act to the ballot, and it was multi-part. And we decided that if we have to go through all of this again, collect over 150,000 signatures, volunteer our time, give all the money we can, we're going to try to help as many dogs as possible. So volunteers joined us across the state, collected the signatures again, and this time the handwriting was on the wall. Everyone knew dog racing was going to end because they knew we had the dog racing tracks numbered. We knew how many dogs were injured, we could tell their stories, and we were going to win. At least that's what we thought. We were much stronger and more organized before. We knew what we were doing. People appreciated that. We were endorsed by veterinarians across the state. Dozens of lawmakers themselves endorsed, which is very unusual. We were endorsed by the NSPCA, the Animal Rescue League of Boston, and the Humane Society of the United States, ASPCA. We had so many people who were rooting for us. But we were in for another big lesson. And just going to, actually, let me go back here. This is an example of an injury report that we put up. All of these names here are dogs who've been injured and the injury that was suffered. And these are all from state records. They weren't our records, they were the state's records describing the injuries that the dogs were suffering. A little bit out of order here, but we were, as I said, in for another surprise. Another track owner this time decided he would sue, and he sued to keep the Dog Protection Act from even going to the ballot. He argued that the question was overly broad and that greyhounds weren't really dogs, so it was misleading to put them in something called the Dog Protection Act. Well, we didn't think for a minute this was going to hold. Well, it did. He won, and we were knocked off the ballot. Strike two, we were handed yet another setback. But our reasoning was this. Greyhounds don't know about elections. Greyhounds don't know about politics. They just know they're in those horrible cages, in that rotten meat, and sometimes they get really hurt and they die. And we wanted to stop that. And we were just as committed to stopping it as before. So we didn't give up. We just don't give up in Massachusetts. This time I wrote the ballot question. It was called the Greyhound Protection Act. We refiled in 2008, actually in 2007 for the 2008 election. This time we had those injury records. We had economic numbers showing a 69% decrease in tax revenue from one track, 37% from the other, and just in the 3 years previous. So we were showing that this was a dying industry that was taking a lot of dogs with it. We had a fact sheet, we had a really great website, we used social media, we used everything we could to get out the message. And the dog on the top of this was named Snake. Snake was rescued from Rainham Park, which was Mr. Carney's track. Just saw a moment ago. And what do you know? The third time was the charm, and we won. The citizens of Massachusetts voted overwhelmingly to prohibit dog racing, and it was by a margin of 12 points. So where we had lost 51-49 in the first ballot initiative campaign, the closest election in state history, I believe, this time we came back and we really got them. Ironically, the 12 or 14 counties, that number meant a lot to me because I looked at the history of efforts to end dog racing in Massachusetts and the progress of how dog racing started. And when dog racing was authorized by the legislature, it also had to be authorized again by each county. The counties could choose to take it or leave it. 12 or 14 counties chose to take it. So this was a reversal of that 1934-1935 vote, which I really got a real kick out of. Well, here we are celebrating. We're so happy we've finally done it. We overcome Sarkis in 2000. We overcame Carney 1 in 2006. Carney 2 in 2008 was another attempt to keep us off the ballot. We actually overcome that. Where before in Carney 1, Mr. Carney argued that our measure was too broad. This time he argued that it wasn't broad enough. So I think the court got that one and said, look, sorry, George, we're not going to help you this time. And we went on to the ballot, and we overcame Carney 2, thank goodness. But that wasn't the end of our legal problems. After the election, a lawsuit was brought by the leading kennel in the state, North Shore Kennel. North Shore Kennel sued for compensation based on an argument that the ballot question was an unconstitutional taking of property and that it had to be compensated for its loss of property. And the property, dogs. Here's a picture of the kennel operator's son, Johnny O'Donnell. He's standing in front of his empty cages. Well, of course, that wasn't factually true or legally valid. Nobody had taken their dogs. They couldn't raise their dogs in Massachusetts anymore, but dog racing is still a peripatetic industry. Kennels travel from state to state. All we did was take Massachusetts out of the circuit. The court saw that, and thankfully, after some time, dismissed this case. There was an appeal, and finally another dismissal just a few months ago. So there's the site for that one. So we've really been through the ringer fighting for the greyhounds in Massachusetts, but it was really worth it. Over 1,000 greyhounds were adopted after dog racing ended in our state, which was the highest number from our state era. It was also a real game changer politically because all of a sudden, dog track owners from across the country knew we meant business and we were going to end dog racing. So they said, well, we can't beat them, let's join them. You know, we're losing money on dog racing. They want to save the dogs, we want to save dollars. Let's get together. Why is this true? Because under the parimutuel law in every state, there's a mandatory minimum live race requirement on the dog track owner. In order to offer any other form of gambling at the facility, he must offer a minimum number of live races. This is the parimutuel statute section in Florida. Here it's 100 race days. This number can actually increase because sometimes when states authorize other forms of gambling, they add more days onto that, which, you know, it just doesn't make sense to force a business to do something it doesn't want to do, and certainly not to force these dogs to suffer. So we have been very effective with this strategy. We prohibited dog racing in New Hampshire and Rhode Island using this strategy in 2010, and we came very close in Florida, and we're going to refile again this year for 2013, and I believe this may be the year for greyhounds in Florida, which would be really fabulous. The only opposition to what we're doing comes from greyhound breeders, because if there are no dogs in the race, they don't get a piece of the pie. They got nothing. So they are, fortunately for us, a very weak voice and a nonsensical voice, and we've been able to overcome their arguments when given the opportunity. So finally, I'm going to end with some predictions. This is my greyhound with her kind of crystal ball. She's looking at the world because dog racing doesn't just occur in the United States. It also happens, and it's quite substantial in the United Kingdom and Australia. The UK has more tracks than we do in the entire United States, 26. Australia, it's a very widespread industry. It's done differently in these localities, but the cruelty is the same in terms of the injuries. The other place in the world that we're really looking is Macau. Macau is a peninsula off mainland China. It was a Portuguese holding, and the Portuguese had a dog track. And the Chinese, though gambling is illegal on the mainland, have allowed the Macau Canodrome to continue to operate. The problem with the Canodrome, the biggest problem, is that about 400 dogs are shipped there from Australia each year to die. There's no adoption program there. So when a dog slows down, is injured beyond profit, that dog gets put down and another dog moved in. It's simple math, just like that. And we're starting with trying to get the Canodrome to have an adoption program, but the end goal is to really close the place down. So my predictions for the future are that we will continue to expose the cruelty of dog racing, we'll pass laws to protect dogs while racing, and ultimately, I believe we will prohibit dog racing in the United States and across the globe. We are a very small organization, but we are very positive thinkers, and we think we can do it. And it sounds like a big goal, doesn't it? It's actually really simple and small. All we want to do is make greyhounds dogs again. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks again to all of our speakers. Unfortunately, we do not have time for questions. We're going to take about a 5-minute break before the next segment. And if you do have questions for our panelists, you can just come up and talk with them individually during the break. Thank you.